It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's talk, which is entitled Mind, Brain, and Culture from a Generalized Darwinian Perspective. Our speaker is Professor David Sloan Wilson, who is internationally recognized as a leading thinker in evolutionary theory and its application across biological and social sciences. And that is why the center that I direct, the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture, has invited him to speak to us today. One of the main reasons is because we're engaged in trying to promote interdisciplinary discussions across different fields that are concerned with issues of mind, brain, and culture, and bridging the biological and social sciences is a major objective. I'll say one or two words about our center in case you're not already familiar with us. This is our mission, which is to support and foster discussion, scholarship, training, and collaboration across diverse disciplines to promote research at the intersection of mind, brain, and culture. We involve the director, myself, the associate director from biology, Robert Liu, as well as an advisory committee that's constituted from people across not just the college, but also the business school and neighboring institutions here in Atlanta to try to bring together this interdisciplinary perspective. And we need a group like this, and in fact, we need you, because although Robert and I do our best to stay in front of interesting interdisciplinary developments and topics, we're limited in our scope. And so we need help from our advisory committee across different disciplines, and also from our constituents, which I would now include all of you, to suggest interesting things that we should be aware of, that we should cover, speakers we should bring in, events we should support. So our doors are always open to suggestions. The main things that we do are putting on lectures like this one, hosting discussion lunches in a smaller format, oftentimes pitting two people on either side of an issue, or to discuss something from a multidisciplinary perspective. We have run several, in recent years, several small conferences and workshops. What I want to point you to is one of the reasons why it took us a while to get things set up here is we're recording this. And we try to record all of our events, assuming the speakers are willing, and put them online in our podcast and video library, which you can access on our website, and it's searchable. So whether you want to do it for general interest, use in teaching, there's a lot of great stuff up there, and you can look around and poke around and see what we've got. So I would point you to that. We've progressed through many of our fall events at this point, but I will point out that on this Friday, we're welcoming Deepu Murthy as part of the Frontiers in Neuroscience series, talking about understanding, remembering, and communicating threatening events. So that's 1 o'clock on Friday, and I would encourage you to attend that. Okay, sorry. That's at 12 o'clock on Friday. Don't show up late because of me. So, an example of some of the workshops and conferences and symposia that we have recently put on, covering everything from embodied cognition to the cognitive science of religion. If you have an idea, I'd love to hear it. For the graduate students out there and their advisors, we have an interdisciplinary certificate program in mind, brain, and culture. You take a core course, we help you choose some interdisciplinary electives, and you become eligible for small grants. You participate in a cohort of like-minded individuals. If you have any interest in that, please reach out to me. Some of our current certificate students, to give you an idea of the range from cultural anthropology to neuroscience to business to English. We also, in the spring, look out for an announcement for applications for our undergraduate fellows. These are final year undergraduates who spend a year with the center participating in our events and small group discussions and networking as a means to enhance their interdisciplinary education. But finally, get on our mailing list by joining as an affiliate, and you'll receive advance notice about any of these events, including some of our lunchtime discussions that book up fairly quickly. So anyway, I'm sorry, already enough about the center. As I mentioned before, we invited Dr. Wilson here because of his interdisciplinary profile, and he was nice enough to put mind, brain, and culture in the title of his talk, which we sincerely appreciate. I've been familiar with his work for a few decades now, but the immediate reason for inviting him, or the impetus, was that we were having an advisory committee meeting in the spring and trying to think, who can we bring in that's going to cross disciplines? Your name came up, and it so happened that this is also Emory's Year of Compassion, right? And we were looking for ways to tie into that. The Year of Compassion is a year-long celebration dedicated to empathy, healing, and human connection. And your work bridging biological and social sciences, as well as topics like the evolution of altruism and your public advocacy as well, made him a perfect candidate for ticking all of these boxes. Dr. Wilson is a distinguished professor emeritus of biological sciences and anthropology at Binghamton University, where he has spent much of his career developing an integrative approach to evolution, behavior, and culture. He's also the founder and president of Pro-Social World, a research and outreach organization dedicated to applying evolutionary principles to enhance cooperation, well-being in groups and societies. Over the course of his career, Professor Wilson has published more than 300, I don't know the current count, quite a few papers, numerous books, including Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, Evolution for Everyone, and This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution. So his research has played a major role in developing the theory of multi-level selection and exploring this intersection of biological and cultural evolution. He was elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he's received numerous honors for his contributions to evolutionary theory and science communication. So I believe in today's lecture, Dr. Wilson will be discussing how a generalized Darwinian framework, that is variation, selection, and replication, can help us understand the complex interplay among mind, brain, and culture. By situating mental and cultural processes within a broader evolutionary context, he invites us to reconsider how adaptive change operates across multiple levels of organization. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Sloan Wilson.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you so much. There's so much alignment between this center, basically, and many people in the audience who I know well and I've had great conversations with, and some I've done with Bobby Paul. I think with you also, I did a print conversation and so on, exploring your work. So it's a big pleasure to be here, and the meetings I had today, spanning the range from disease biology to evolutionary psychology to businesses and organizations, is exactly what we're all about here. So there we go. Okay, great. So this is an image of the psychology department building at Binghamton University. What we're seeing here is a giant image of a brain displayed on their window here. And it's a good department. I have lots of colleagues there. But really, when you think of it, what were they thinking to think that the discipline of psychology can be reduced to what takes place within a single brain? I mean, isn't this absurd? This is only slightly better. This is an image I got for typing in whole person. I think that's a businessman doing a happy dance, as far as I can, as far as I can tell. And so, okay, we've gone from the brain to a whole person, but still, it's leaving out almost everything that's social or institutional or cultural. So, what were we thinking, and what have we been thinking for the entire 20th century and before, which we can call the age of reductionism and individualism? And it's a mistake to focus on any one discipline. For example, to say that, why did evolutionary biology go through its selfish gene period? Or why did economics go through its rational actor period? When in fact, every discipline, like a tide lifting all boats, went through a reductionistic and individualistic period during the 20th century. This is a documentary series that was only recently brought to my attention, The Century of the Self, BBC. Well worth, do you know about it? Does anyone know about this series? It begins with Freud and it proceeds through the self-empowerment movements and how all of this seeped into public relations and, of course, advertising and then politics. And so everything centered about the individual. And so the objectives of my talk is to a little time explaining why individualism and reductionism have been so strong in the past, and how we can call the 21st century an age of holism and interactionism, thanks to a new paradigm based on complex system science and generalized Darwinism, and then to explore some of the tools in the generalized Darwinism toolkit and apply those tools to use in everyday life. And so an important theme of my talk is how much we need to apply these ideas outside the ivory tower in everyday life. So I've listed all of these different topic areas, and the same paradigm can be brought to bear on each and every one of them. So I want to begin by just discussing a little bit, what do we mean by the word paradigm? It's a very overused word. Often we mean it to mean my new thing. But I think it does have an important meaning, an interlocking set of ideas that make sense of the world, but has difficulty escaping its own assumptions. And Einstein got it right when he said, whether you can observe a thing or not depends on the theory which you use. It is the theory which decides what can be observed. So there's something about a paradigm that organizes our experience, an interlocking set of ideas, but also blinds us to other things, have difficulty explaining, escaping its own assumptions. That, to me, is the substantive meaning of the word paradigm. And against that background, we can identify the problem of the wrong paradigm. In economics, it's neoclassical economics, and it's represented by this quote here from a paper titled "Economics is Universal Science." Its formal mode of argument, mathematical apparatus, spare language, and rigorous logic have made it the model for the softer social sciences. And whatever else you might think about neoclassical economics, you do have to grant that it's an interlocking set of ideas, which accounts for its coherence and its dominance, not only in the economic profession, but its invasive quality. Economic thinking has invaded every other discipline in the human social sciences, including the sociology of religion. And so, so it might not be the right paradigm. It might lead to harmful consequences, but it definitely is a interlocking set of ideas. So in addition to the problem of the wrong paradigm, I think we can also identify the problem of no paradigm. Many islands of thought and practice with little communication among islands. And so I think that point made about the softer social sciences, there's something to it, because there's no interlocking set of ideas that unites certainly not all the social sciences, and not even any particular discipline, which is just school of thought after school of thought. And this must be an impediment to transdisciplinary research, of course, a Tower of Babel, you might say. And as I was just preparing to give my talk here and going on to the CMBC website, you said it for me, basically, that the whole purpose of the center is institutional isolation, the lack of shared vocabulary, and other communication barriers present obstacles to realizing the potential for interdisciplinary synthesis, synergy, and innovation. So we have the wrong paradigm, we have no paradigm. What might be the new paradigm? And I'm happy to tell you that there is one. So, and it's a combination of two bodies of thought, one complex system science and generalized Darwinism. And I think we can make a very legitimate claim that these are new within the last 50 years for different reasons. So why is complex system science new? In some sense, it's not new, because verbal appreciation of complexity has been with us forever, including indigenous cultures. So verbally, we've appreciated complexity for as long as we've talked about it. But modeling complexity formally required the advent of widespread computing ability. And just look at the dates of the founding of the Santa Fe Institute, one of the main hubs for complex system science, 1984, the first popular book on complex system science, 1987, well within my 50-year window. And I love this example of a jointed pendulum here as an example of complex systems. So if you look at the first joint of this pendulum, it just traces the red arc there, this boring red arc. It doesn't matter how far you displace it, it still traces the same arc. And then you add one joint to the pendulum and you see what the blue line is being traced, and it's tracing this amazingly complex pattern. This is all deterministic, so if you displace the pendulum to exactly the same degree, it will trace exactly the same pattern. But if you just a little bit of a difference in the initial displacement traces a completely different pattern. And so just adding one joint to a pendulum takes you from this simple region into this more complex region beyond which formal modeling could not go before the advent of computing. And so we live in the blue world, and nearly everything that takes place around us is the blue world, not the red world. And we couldn't even enter that world until widespread computing ability. So now we have a toolkit that's been developed, and I think these terms are pretty familiar to most people: extreme interdependence, non-equilibrium dynamics, multiple basins of attraction, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, complex emergent properties of simple interactions, scaling laws, represented here by Jeffrey West from the Santa Fe Institute. And so this is not an island. This is a toolkit that can be applied to all of the islands in the archipelago. Now, to begin with Darwin and generalized Darwinism, we need to go back and ask just what made Darwin's theory so revolutionary in the first place. And so we knew before that all organisms have a physical basis. Now we call that proximate causation. And Darwin and Wallace's contribution was also to say that all organisms are also shaped by selection operating on heritable variation. We know this today as ultimate causation. This is evolution 101, so pretty sure that this is all just review for you. But what this enables us to do is to predict the properties of organisms, to explain them in terms of the shaping influence of the environment whenever there's heritable variation, without requiring any knowledge of the physical makeup of the organism at all. And so this is a radical form of holism that's consistent with materialism. It doesn't deny materialism, but it does not require materialism in making its predictions. And so, for example, we can predict that many desert organisms should be sandy colored to avoid being detected by their predators and prey. We can make this prediction for any color of sand, white, brown, or black. Any desert organism, snails, insects, vertebrates, birds, even though they're made from different exteriors and have different genes. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing that we can do that? And we can do it again and again and again for all aspects of life. And this was apparent from the very beginning. This is a book that was written in the 1950s. I'm just happening to read it now. And it's a dual biography of Darwin and Huxley. And it's just really well written by its author, William Irvine. And what it shows is just like the sensation that the publication of the origin was. Evolution wasn't new. There was lots of speculation about evolution before that, but the degree to which Darwin provided in the first place this simple explanation based on variation, selection, and replication, and in the second place, and this is what was made him different, he had applied it so conscientiously to all of these different topics that wherever you looked, it was making sense of the facts which had already existed before. And so we can see this as like the transition from no paradigm, just lots and lots of facts, without any unifying conceptual framework, to a new paradigm that made all the difference in how you see the world. So I think the whole concept of paradigms is represented by Darwin's theory of evolution at the beginning. And then as the decades went by and the amount of information just increased by orders of magnitude, it was still the case in 1973 that Dobzhansky could declare that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And we can fast forward today where the amount of information has grown still larger by orders of magnitude, and we can still say that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, because it's organizing that information. No matter how much of it there is, it still serves as an organizational framework. Really amazing when you just kind of pause to think about it. But then with the advent of genetics, in the early 20th century, we had what was called the modern synthesis, and which could also be called the Great Constriction, in which evolution, for all of its insights in biology, leading to Dobzhansky's statement, was confined to biology and eclipsed other processes that combine the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. And this is like unintendedly represented in this mosaic art here, where we have Dobzhansky's statement around the circle, but what's in the middle? A double helix. And around the world, when you say the word evolution, people hear the word genes. At the novice and at the expert level alike. And so what's new is to go back to basics. Basically go back to where Darwin was in the absence of any knowledge about mechanisms, and to define Darwinism as any process that combines the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. So that applies to genetics, to epigenetics, changes in gene expression rather than gene frequency, forms of social learning found in many species, forms of symbolic thought that are distinctively human, therefore human cultural evolution, artificial intelligence, which equally could be called artificial evolution, and Darwinian processes can be intragenerational in addition to intergenerational. We see this in, for example, the immune system, the adaptive component of the immune system, the formation of many millions of antibodies and the selection of those that bind to antigens, and also in our open-ended behavioral abilities. And as Skinner put it, selection by consequences, basically, in one of his articles, that operant conditioning is basically a Darwinian process taking place within individuals in addition to between generations. So we could think of each and every individual person as an open-ended Darwinian process in addition to what takes place intergenerationally. And so now we have another toolkit, the Generalized Darwinism toolkit. It's kind of uniquely special that in this audience, typically when I give this talk, I say just you can review this as a kind of a literacy test to see how familiar you are with the Darwinian toolkit. And in this audience, I'm pretty sure that the literacy is pretty high. And at the lunch meeting today with 5 students, I mentioned the phrase Tinbergen's 4 questions, and everyone nodded their heads. And that never happens with other audience. I'm so delighted basically to be here where people have really understand the, and as with complex system science, this is not an island, but a toolkit can be applied on all islands studying living systems, including human living systems. And so, so now we can say, in addition to the natural world, seen through the lens of a new paradigm, we can apply this paradigm to the human world. That's what's been taking place since the 1970s. And so much of this literature, so one point I want to make, this is not future tense, this is present tense. I would say this is in full swing. It's represented by many of the people here. It is, and yet it is far less well known than complex systems science, and almost completely unknown in public policy circles. Also, that the integration between complex system science and generalized Darwinism is still a work in progress. And I'm actually not going to talk about that more in this talk, but happy to do so in the Q&A, because there's a pretty important sense in which these need to be described as two bodies of information, new for different reasons, and in need of integration. And there's quite a few examples of problems that have been more or less addressed from a complex systems perspective, but they really need a generalized Darwinian perspective. And so there's much to say there that I just can't for lack of time. So then to summarize, we can say, I think quite authentically, that there is a new paradigm, and it consists of these two toolkits. We don't have to cast about for the new paradigm. We can say this is something that already exists and is in progress. The main thing is to accelerate it and make it more widely known and applied than currently the case. So one major branch of generalized Darwinism is dual inheritance theory, and people like Bobby Paul have contributed very importantly to it. And very simply, it notes that there's two streams of inheritance in our species. And just to go through it a little bit carefully, all of you have a genotype, a collection of genes. Those genes influence just about everything that could be measured about you. We call that your phenotype. All of you, because you're humans, also have a symbolic system inside your head. Your symbotype, let's use the word symbotype to stress the comparison with the genotype. Your symbotype and genotype interact with each other during your lifetime. That's where epigenetics comes in, and they've also been co-evolving throughout our history as a species. And your current symbotype, no matter what it is, also influences just about everything we can measure in you, your very same phenotype. Your genotype and symbotype each result in a degree of flexibility. So you have a behavioral repertoire with your existing genotype and symbotype. But to go beyond that repertoire of behavior, your phenotype, you have to change either your genotype or your symbotype. Of course, your genotype remains fixed throughout your lifetime, barring gene therapy and mutation. But your symbotype can change during the course of your lifetime. And so in order to substantially change what we do on the outside, we also need to change what we do on how we think and feel on the inside. And although there's a sense in which this is not new, branches of the social sciences would have been saying something like this, of course, just to address the topic. For me, at least, there's a tremendous metaphorical transfer in thinking about our symbolic systems as the cultural equivalent of our genes. And we can apply that to a whole host of topics here, including, of course, therapy and training. And so now I'd like to focus on my life work, basically, which is the evolution of prosociality, which we can define as anything oriented towards the welfare of others or one's group as a whole. It is a broader term than altruism, which typically implies that helping others requires some degree of self-sacrifice. And prosocial admits the possibility of win-win situations. So it's like a one-dimensional word, anything that benefits others or one society as a whole. So what can we say about prosociality from a generalized Darwinism perspective, which applies to any variation, selection, and replication process? What we can say is that prosociality has an inherent disadvantage in within-group competition. So Darwinian selection is based on relative fitness. Prosocial behaviors inherently require time, energy, and risk on the part of the prosocial individual, and this places the prosocial individual at a disadvantage relative to more self-oriented individuals in the same group. This is completely elementary and fundamental. And it even extends to the case of a no-cost public good. So imagine a behavior that provides a benefit to everyone in a group, including the actor, at no cost to the actor. This might be unrealistic, but it's useful for illustrative purposes. And so what we can say is that this behavior is not selected within the group because it does not generate any fitness differences. There are no fitness differences in a win-win situation. And any cost to providing the public good, no matter how small, places the public good provider at a relative fitness disadvantage. Okay, so that's the evolution of prosociality starts out with a strike against it. So this is completely fundamental to any Darwinian process. So that's the bad news. The good news, thankfully, is that prosociality has an inherent advantage in between group competition. So groups of individuals who behave prosocially towards each other have a robust advantage over groups whose members cannot go. That's just as fundamental. And it's represented perfectly in sports teams, basically, in which the competition basically is between groups, and the more cooperative groups win over the less cooperative groups. So go Eagles. So, and so that leads, in a nutshell, to multi-level selection theory and the article that I wrote with Edward O. Wilson, and basically our effort to drag evolution beyond its selfish gene phase into something that's more holistic. And as we concluded the article, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. And this logic of multi-level selection can be, which I've described as two-level selection, can be stretched out to multiple tiers. And we can say that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist who turns gold into lead. And so self-interest, self-preservation becomes self-dealing. Helping family and friends becomes nepotism and cronyism. Maximizing shareholder profits becomes extreme inequality. Growing the economy, overheating the earth. Isn't it amazing to think that nearly everything we regard as a problem at a large scale can be attributed not to selfishness, but to cooperation at a lower scale, And so prosociality is both the problem and the solution. If you don't understand that, then you really don't understand most of the problems that we're faced with today. And so a famous experiment that illustrates all this was performed by a poultry breeder named Bill Muir. And so in this experiment, chickens live in groups. They've always lived in groups. Sorry to say they live in cages in the modern poultry industry. And in one experiment, the most productive hen within each group was selected to breed the next generation of hens. And in the second experiment, the most productive groups of hens were selected as a group to breed the next generation of hens. And so I think that you can see that the first experiment represents pure within-group selection. And you might think that egg-laying productivity is an individual trait. After all, it's individuals who lay eggs. But what that ignores is that egg-laying is also a social behavior, and the most productive hen within each group was the biggest bully who achieved her productivity by suppressing the productivity of the other hens. Remember, natural selection is based on relative fitness. And so 5 generations of selecting the biggest bully in every group resulted in a hyper-aggressive strain of hens who were murdering each other and plucking each other's feathers. And egg productivity, of course, plummeted, despite the fact that you were selecting the most productive individual in each and every group. Selecting the most productive groups, we're selecting for the most companionable hens, and productivity increased by 160%. So this is exactly what you'd expect from within and between group selection. But it requires thinking of a trait that manifests as an individual behavior as a social trait. That's the key insight. So this by itself has important implications for animal breeding, all by itself, before we extrapolate to the human case. And it also applies to sports teams, because even though sports teams are in large part a process of between-group competition, there's also competition within teams, and especially in teams which actually they commit the same fallacy as the chicken experiment by thinking that the performance of a sports team can be traced to the talents of its individual members. And so you might pay a lot of money for some star performer, and what you've done is you've created inequities within the group. And the research shows, in this case for baseball, that players on teams with greater dispersion in pay have lower winning percentages, gate receipts, and media income. So here's a case where there's selection, cultural selection, both within and between groups. And the more within group selection, then the more the groups fall apart as cooperative groups. And so what we can say on the basis of this is, first of all, we can make statements about our origin as a species, and we can think about human evolution as a major evolutionary transition, similar to previous transitions in individuality, whereby basically groups became so cooperative that they became higher level individuals. And so naked aggression is over 100 times more frequent in chimp communities than human communities. This is due largely to the ability of group members to resist bullying and other forms of disruptive selfish behavior. Christopher Bohm called this reverse dominance. And then Richard Wrangham calls this self-domestication. And so first we evolved to be highly cooperative, and then everything else distinctive about us is a form of cooperation, including our capacity for symbolic thought. And so this is sometimes called the cooperation came first hypothesis. So basically we can make statements, grand statements about our evolution as a species, but it also becomes highly relevant to cooperation in everyday life. And so this is Elinor Ostrom. She's a political scientist by training. She won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. What she did was study the tragedy of the commons, basically, groups that attempt to manage common pool resources. And it's there that selfishness takes the form of taking more than your share. Altruism takes the form of managing the resource. Conventional wisdom was that the tragedy of the commons will always occur unless you privatize the resource when possible or manage it in a top-down fashion. And what Ostrom showed, which earned her the Nobel Prize, was that some groups, not all, some groups attempting to manage their common pool of resources are able to self-govern their resources, avoid the tragedy of the commons, but only if they implement certain core design principles. And her achievement was to identify those core design principles. And so I'm going to list these principles. But before I do, I want to ask you to keep a group in mind. Bring a group in mind that you know well. That could be any group of your choice. It might work well or poorly. And then as I go through these core design principles, just see how well your group implements these core design principles and relate that to how they function as a group. So first core design principle is a clear sense of identity and purpose. You have to know that you're a group. The group has to be a meaningful group. There must be good reasons to be in it. Who's a member? What are its boundaries? So this is basically defining the existence and the value of the group. Equitable distribution of benefits and resources. Not sustainable for some members of the group to do all the work and for other members of the group to get the benefits. There must be some sense in what you get from the group is proportionate to what you give to the group. Decision-making needs to be inclusive. Not sustainable for some members of the group to make the decisions and other members to be left out of that process. In the first place, that's a recipe for unfairness. In the second place, it doesn't make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. There must be transparency of behavior. We must know if we're doing what we're supposed to do. And if we're not, then there has to be something must be done. It need not start out harsh or mean-spirited. It can be friendly reminders, it's typically enough, but it must be able to escalate in cases where basically nothing is done. So the idea of graduated sanctions is the negative part of that. And at the same time, we need to be rewarding good behavior at the same time that we're punishing bad behavior. And in some of the best performing groups, they talk about a 6-to-1 ratio of rewarding good behavior to correcting bad behavior. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved fast and fairly. The group has to have the authority to self-govern so that they can basically manage their own affairs. And then all of this package has to be replicated for between group relations in addition to within group relations. So these principles are scale independence. They're needed for between group interactions in addition to within group interaction. So, first of all, I think you can say, well, first of all, how did your groups do? I'd like to know, how many of you actually had in mind high-performing groups? Some of you, few of you, had a high-performing group in mind. I'm imagining that they probably implemented these core design principles pretty well. How many of you had low-performing groups? And more of you. How many of you had academic groups? And in mind, how did that go? Now, I mean, we need to take that seriously. I will return to that. And I hope you can see that this makes perfect sense from a multi-level evolutionary perspective. What these core design principles do is suppress the potential for disruptive self-serving behavior within groups so that the group becomes the primary unit of selection. So now basically between groups, it's not that competition has gone away. We need competition. Change is some form of competition, but the competition needs to be at the group level, and it needs to be suppressed at the within group at the level. And so this is really a miniature major evolutionary transition of individuality. So based on this, and I was lucky to collaborate with Elinor Ostrom for 3 years prior to her death, we can generalize this basically, and we can say that this is all groups need these core design principles. This is fundamental to cooperation in all of its forms. So that's the prediction. And in this survey study, we basically asked participants to do what I asked you to do, and to do it for 2 groups, workplace groups, so we were interested in business groups, compared to any other groups of their choice. And so they indicated how well the groups implemented the core design principles, how well they functioned as groups with respect to trust, satisfaction, needs, cooperation, and commitment. And the results were, in the first place, a strong correlation between implementation of the CDPs and performance outcomes for all kinds of groups. So that prediction was confirmed. All groups need the core design principles. And the second result was that on average, workplace groups were deficient in all 8 core design principles, with the largest deficits being local autonomy. Many people can't do their jobs as they see fit. Sense of identity and purpose. Many people don't find much meaning in their jobs. And decision making. Many people are basically influenced by decisions that they had no. Does this sound familiar? And so, but isn't it amazing that business groups, where most of the economic activity takes place, is deficient in all 8 core design principles? Why should that be? In large part because of the way we think about it. So this brings us back to symbotypes and paradigms. If you have Milton Friedman inside your head, the shareholder value model, then that's going to orient your experience and cause certain things to make sense. And if you have Elinor Ostrom inside your head, then you'll basically have a different common sense. And so this applies not just to economics, but to so many other walks of our life, including education. I think it's really disturbing to think that not only is this a problem in our workplaces, but it's something we inflict upon our children in K-12 education and ourselves in higher education. When you turn this lens onto higher education, it is not a pretty sight. And there's a wonderful article that's appearing on this, that's being prepared on this subject by one of my colleagues named Jan Pfister in Finland that we'll be able to circulate, which trains this lens on higher education. And what it shows is that groups in higher education, such as laboratory groups or departments, they struggle to be pro-social against the structure of the university, which is basically making it difficult to be pro-social. And so there's so much to say about higher education in addition to businesses. Basically, what we're doing without knowing it, is we're creating the analogs of the first chicken experiment. Now, going back to that study, what we've shown is basically, business groups on average are deficient in all 8 core design principles, but they still have a distribution. And so there's still a high end of the distribution for businesses. And we can look at these high-performing businesses and we can make the prediction that the reason they're high-performing is because they have adopted the core design principles, even though that required forgetting everything that they learned in business school. And so we have excellent examples of that. This is one thing that I spend quite a lot of time doing, is looking at high-performing businesses. This is one, a manufacturing firm named Barry Waymiller. It makes stuff. There's nothing noble about what it makes, but it has an amazingly pro-social culture. And not only that, but it has proceeded to acquire over 140 other businesses worldwide and turning them around as well. And if you look at how they do it, there's a beautiful fit between what they've converged upon and the core design principles. This is what we find again and again and again. So properly understood, what we have that exists already is a replicated experiment in pro-social cultural evolution 140 times cross-culturally around the world, but nobody sees it that way because they just don't approach it from this perspective. And there's 2 podcasts that I've done and a book written on the topic, Everyone Matters, by Raj Sisodia. Bob Chapman is the CEO. And so you might ask, when we approach these high-performing companies and we present them with this new theoretical lens, how do they respond? It's already well known in their own way. They're already performing high. So what's the added value for them? And the answer is there's a very substantial added value, because these businesses are so contrary to the neoclassical paradigm that they're easily dismissed as oddities that can't be emulated by other businesses. And so a typical response is, well, that's all very well for Patagonia or Ben & Jerry's, but we couldn't do that in our business. And what the new paradigm says is, on the contrary, this is exactly what we expect for businesses to work. And so this is affirming the theory as opposed to being dumbfounding with respect to the theory. And so then these high-performing businesses that already exist have already brilliantly implemented the core design principles in their own way, can be seen for what they are, and then can become role models for all groups, all organizations to follow. And so this leads to this phenomenon of hiding in plain sight. There's good practices, best practices all around us. Ostrom is little known or cited in the sprawling management literature. Easy enough to use search terms that represent the core design principles. And when you do, the evidence for the efficacy of the CDPs is overwhelming. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis is affirming the efficacy of these core design principles, almost as if further research is unnecessary. And of course, we want to do further research, but that's the degree to which the evidence is hiding in plain sight. And also, so an outstanding example of the theory deciding what could be observed. And what's also hiding in plain sight is the evidence against the old paradigm. And so here's a beautiful paper called Evidence-Based Management, a famous paper by 2 Stanford professors, Evidence-Based Management. And they raised the question, first of all, of course, medical practice is evidence-based, right? Well, actually not. You're laughing. And so, what is it based on? Obsolete knowledge gained in school, long-standing but never proven traditions, so on and so forth. And they say they want you to know business and management is even worse for being evidence-based. And Exhibit A is the practice of forced ranking, also called rank and yank. And so this is very common, where you rank your employees, you reward the top performers, you coach the middle, and then you dismiss the lowest performers, and then you just repeat that again and again. It has a logic. Everything has a logic. Everything makes sense. We don't do anything that truly doesn't make sense compared to what's inside our heads. And so the logic here is, just as with the chicken experiment, the performance of the individual is a property of the individual. And if that were true, the main challenge is to find the high performers, like sifting among pebbles to find the gold nuggets. That would make sense, but it ignores the performance of social interactions altogether and discourages any activity that makes anyone else look better than you, just like the first chicken experiment. So what does the evidence say? We can find plenty of consultants and gurus who praise the power of dispersed pay, but we can't find a single careful study that supports its value in settings where cooperation, coordination, and information sharing are crucial to their performance. In a recent study, even though over half the companies use forced ranking, the respondents reported lower productivity, inequity, skepticism, decreased employee engagement, reduced collaboration, damaged morale, and mistrust in and that's what the evidence says. And there's plenty of evidence that performance improves with team continuity and time and position. 2 reasons to avoid the churn of what's been called rank and yank. The power of such joint experience has been established in every setting examined, from string quartets to surgical teams, to top management teams to airplane. That's the degree to which the theory decides what can be observed. That this is all out there hiding in plain sight, but we don't see it if we have a certain lens, and then we do see it if we exchange the paradigmatic lens. And so I'm finishing up here with the 20th century as an age of holism and interactionism. And we haven't lost the brain as an object of study, and we haven't even lost the whole person in terms of their individual development. But what we've added is something that, like this third figure here, which is a schematic of polycentric governance, in which life consists of many kinds of groups and many different levels of groups. And all of this has to be evolved and orchestrated from a cultural evolutionary perspective. And so we have to operate at the macro level, ultimately the scale of the whole Earth. That has to be our ultimate unit, ultimate target of selection. The invisible hand metaphor is profoundly untrue. We have to be responsible for our externalities. We have to write at the micro level, which is not just individuals, but individuals functioning in the context of small, meaningful, and appropriately structured groups. These are all the groups of our lives. We have to operate simultaneously at those levels. And then we have to operate at the mesoscale, which is a tropical rainforest of social identities, institutions, and processes that comprise the social physiology of the group group organism. That's the fully rounded approach. And this is a little bit of an odd way to end my talk by promoting a book which has not yet been published yet by an author other than myself. But this is a fellow named Patrick McNamara, and he has a book. Have anyone heard of this gentleman? Great. He's at the Boston University School of Medicine, and I was sent his book to endorse by Cambridge University Press. It will be published in 2026. And the title is From Groups to Gods, Neuroscience and Evolutionary Studies of the Collective Mind. And I end my talk here because I think it's like an example of the age of holism and interactionism. In the first place, neuroscience is in there. He's a neuroscientist, and so we haven't left it out, but we've incorporated it into a fully rounded Tinbergen 4 questions approach: function, history, mechanism, development. So this represents a fully rounded Tinbergen approach. And secondly, as I read this book, he was writing about the collective mind as if it's the only thing that makes sense. And 30 or 40 years ago, it would have been regarded as science fiction. But today we can say that, of course, if functional organization exists above the level of the individual, as of course it does. If groups are highly cooperative and groups of groups, multi-group societies are highly cooperative, of course there's going to be processes that we would regard as mental in the same way that they're regarded mental at the individual level. And so the idea of a collective mind goes from being the dumbfounding or marginalized to being the only thing that makes sense. And so I think this is what we can look forward to. This is as it should be in the age of holism and interactionism. And then my final thought is to return to the idea that these ideas, which are so explanatory in everything we study inside the ivory tower, need to be taken outside the ivory tower, because the world will not weight. I mean, all of us have a profound sense of the world falling apart, basically. And so we really need this new paradigm, not just to be thinking about it as academics, but to actually be applying it in the real world, as I'm doing. And I would encourage everyone else to join as individuals and collectively as a center, such as this one. So thank you very much.
We have time for questions, and I'll let you handle it. We're going to try desperately to get you to ask your question into this microphone. Questions?
Right behind you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Is this on? So I'm sitting here thinking about like if the pro-social groups or businesses are so much better, like why aren't there more of them around in the world? And I'm wondering if the answer is that there's some higher structure that's sort of preventing that. Like you mentioned, the university is
That's a part of it.
yeah. So how is it that as a species we're so good at creating these kind of global cooperative relationships that sort of crush pro-sociality and hurt people, but we're so bad at creating large-scale cooperative arrangements that actually help people? I mean, especially given you mentioned we evolved cooperativity first, but we're still so bad at it.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that we're so bad at it, and at all scales, what you find is like what Eleanor Ostrom found in terms of variation, basically. And the reason that groups don't automatically employ the core design principles is because the temptations of within group advantage are very strong, and people with power don't just go lightly into the night. And often you have, like, there's a lot of path dependence and basins of attraction and so on. And so if something has gone in an extractive path, then it's very hard to dig your way out of it. It's less basically a contest between altruism and selfishness as a contest between different basins of attraction, different basically locally stable configurations. But at all scales, for example, at the national scale, the most recent recipient of the Nobel Prize was Darren Acemoglu and William Robinson, who wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. And the thesis of their book is that nations vary along a continuum from what they call inclusive and extractive. And the inclusive societies are relatively for the benefit of everyone. The extractive are for the benefit of the elites. And the inclusive societies function better as societies, and they tend to outperform the extractive societies in economic and military competition. So you do have that, even at this larger scale, you do have between group selection resulting in societies that are impressively well organized and even democratic and cooperative. So it's not all bad news, but then you have all this other stuff. So you've asked a very large question, and my answer has been inadequate, but I think that that's the best I can do just in a little bit. So let's just continue that thread. Or anyone else bring up similar questions? Is there anything more you'd like to add before?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for a great talk.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in pro-sociality through like critiquing Western neoliberalism and how this type of selfishness and also even the institution of neoclassical economics comes from a very Western ivory tower. And I'm interested if you know about what the research looks like in communities in the Global South. I know you mentioned that in Indigenous communities, this idea of verbal complexity has been a topic of concern, but what can society, as like a selfishly oriented society in the West, learn from other communities that may be more culturally or ethnically oriented towards pro-sociality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And all of these are big questions that require long answers, which is not a possibility. So I just want to, first of all, signal it's a great question and it deserves extended discussion. And one thing we could look at is indigenous societies and hunter-gatherer societies, especially hunter-gatherer societies, which I think there's a lot of instruction there. And there what you see is a lot of Ostromian groups. I mean, basically, the Ostromian group is very close to the reverse dominance group of Christopher Boehm. And I have a two-part podcast with an evolutionary anthropologist named Vivek Venkatamaran, which explores this terrain, and it's so very interesting. But the bottom line is, if you kind of, and we do this in the podcast, is just go down the list of the core design principles, and then you see how these are manifested in hunter-gatherer society. And there's a very good fit. Now, that said, that cooperation, always you go from within group to between group. And so warfare has always existed. And so I think that we don't want to have an over-romanticized view of any traditional society. There's always cases where despotism, and basically it can go in an extractive direction, or even when it's cooperative, then it's very much parochial altruism, as they put it, and so on and so forth. So, and then if you look at other governance, like for example in the global South and the various forms of governance, one thing that you find is that in Latin America, for example, often from the very beginning, this is covered a little bit in Why Nations Fail, is the governance that formed was, quite elitist and not democratic and so on. And so basically that history that goes back to the Spanish and Portuguese colonization is still there. And so it goes on and on like that. And the final point I'll make is that when I was talking with Bob Chapman, the CEO of this manufacturing firm, Barry Miller, and he was saying how he's done this 140 times, and all around the world, France, Korea, China, Bulgaria. And I asked him, Bob, you can't tell me that you can do this again and again in all different cultures. And he said, yes, I can. It's like feeding candy to a baby. And what he meant by that is that anyone in any culture wants to be respected, wants to have a voice, and not to be just jerked around and be treated like chattel, which is the way it is in the traditional business cultures. And so they're like moved to tears. And all of a sudden and I'm moved to tears, that there's a company that truly cares about its people. And he came by it from a religious direction. He's not a scientist. He's a good Christian. And who has embodied this. He says that he came to him in a series of revelations that you should be treating his workers like his children. So anyhow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, David. I hope this is a somewhat more narrow question. I'm just interested in terms of the design principles relative to at least a couple of existing systems that have been out there for a while in our society, for example, and how much they do and don't match up. And that's specifically co-ops and ESOPs, both of which seem to me to sort of capture at least some of the spirit of what's going on here.
Yeah, ESOPs, or what are ESOPs?
Employee stock option programs.
Right. And there's a literature on those. And I think that a lot of the literature shows that, for example, employee-owned businesses and the more the employees are sharing the benefits, that does lead to a very strong business model. So basically, it's as you would expect from an Ostromian direction. If you look at some co-ops, especially informal ones, then what you often have is you get people getting together. They have a cooperative intent, but they really know very little about structure. And this is also true of some movements. There's a beautiful essay by a feminist, oh golly, I'm forgetting her name, but the essay is titled "The Tyranny of Structurelessness." And it's just like, for people that complain about the existing structure of society, like a patriarchal society, the response is, we don't want any structure. And this person is here to say, no, that never works. There's no such thing as no structure. If there's no structure, then you're going to get somebody taking over. And so the appreciation of structure is something that cooperative movements often have to relearn the hard way. Because in the absence of structure, then you get all the problems, free riding, few people doing most of the work, all of this kind of thing. And so the need for structure is paramount. And just to give an example of that, I've spent a lot of time working with and studying Plum Village, one of the monastery founded by Thich Nhat Hanh in France. And so this is engaged Buddhism. It's a monastery with monks and nuns. And Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book on the monastic rules, the rules of a 21st century monastery. And you might think that a community like this, which is spiritually enlightened, the more spiritually enlightened they are, the less structure they need. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. You can't believe the structure that these nuns and monks have to do. They have like hundreds of precepts that they have to memorize and recite in a ceremony twice a month. And if they violated any of these precepts, then there's this whole thing about that basically falls into graduated sanctions. And so the need for structure, I think, is when this is also, as we've been having conversations with compassion training and a big focus on compassion, which tends to be imbalanced in terms of making you compassionate minded. That's the inner part. And not paying enough attention to the structure that's needed for compassionate action to actually be effective. And so inner and outer including not just what you do as an individual because you've become so motivated, but the structure that's needed to do anything as a group, not to speak of groups, which is needed. That's the full package. And so anyhow, that's.
I was just curious about the lack of success of the apes relative to humans.
Of the what?
Relative to humans, and particularly in the context, I know you worked with E.O. Wilson, particularly in the context of ants and their would you call that pro-social behavior?
Ants pro-social? Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So that's the shortest answer I can give. Yes. But now there's more. Do you want to add more? We have someone else here, but of course they're operating according to different principles. But
Yeah.
And so I mean, crudely speaking, this is something that Terry Deacon said. Many of you are familiar with Terry Deacon. So you might loosely call ants genetically eusocial, and Terry Deacon says that us humans, we're symbolically eusocial. The glue that holds us together is not genetic relatedness, not merely genetic relatedness, especially in our large groups. It's the symbolic systems that we share. And we're so inextricably woven into it. There's no way we can tear ourselves out of our symbolic system. So it's very largely due to that, plus the structure of a religion. So back to external and all of the social structure of a religion. So we're both ultra social for different reasons. But another point I want to make is that when we talk about group level organisms, it is not the case that individuals lose their agency, because what you can see from the core design principles is that they're inherently participatory. They require the individual to be involved. They're micro-democracies is what they are. And so this is very encouraging in terms of the need for democratic society, participatory society. The answer to that is yes, it is needed. And individuals don't lose their agency within their groups, and groups don't lose their agency within the largest groups. And then finally, do you know that's also true for the bees? And there's a wonderful book that I'll recommend called The Mind of a Bee. That's the title, The Mind of a Bee. And what it shows is that despite the fact that bees in some ways are just like, cells of a superorganism, the amount of cognition that takes place at the level of the individual bee, unbelievable. Unbelievable. the degree to which the individual bee has a mind of its own. And of course, that's also true for individual people. And that's true, anything. Cells, look at the work of Michael Levin. Oh my gosh. I mean, so anyhow.
That was a simple question.
Maybe one more. Last question.
Thank you. So there's this book called The Social Instinct by Nicola Raihani, and it's about cooperation. And one of the chapters is about how cooperation always has victims. So, in Elinor Ostrom's example, you have fisheries, but the fish are still dying. So they're always victims. And so one way in which, we now have corporations like fossil fuel companies that cooperate very well and thus have survived for a very long time, but they're causing global warming. So, and global warming is the kind of problem that's really hard to solve because it happens very slowly. And so we discount it. And it has other features that just make us not care about it. So how do you deal with a problem like this where cooperation in companies like fossil fuel companies is actually causing the problem?
Well, that's what I described as the perverse alchemist problem. So exactly that. First of all, so many of these problems are caused by lower level cooperation. So that's the point you're making. And it's a point that I also made. When we come to the question of is it inevitable, then I think the answer is thankfully no. And one way to express that is, as a biologist, if we look at all the different relationships among species, what we find is the full range from competition and predation, parasitism, all the way to commensalism and mutualism. And so when we look at relations among human groups, what we should predict is we should predict the full range. And so therefore, if we want to basically get things to be more mutualistic, we definitely have to be intentional about the cultural evolutionary process. So something I think was implicit in what I was saying, and now can be more explicit, is that this needs to be conscious multi-level cultural evolution. If we just let it take place, then we will get these negative externalities for sure. And so therefore, we have to be very explicit in what we do. We have to, first of all, and this gets us back to measurement, we have to know what are the externalities of what our groups are trying to do. There might be positive or negative externalities. If they're negative externalities, we have to do something about that. And that doesn't always go up to the global scale. There's this principle of subsidiarity, basically, that originated in the Catholic Church, that lower level units should do what they want to do and only need correction if there's some problem that they create higher up the scale. But it does have to be a very intentional process. And ultimately, it does have to have the largest scale that contains the externalities in mind, which in many cases is going to be the global scale. So there has to be some part of our identity that says, first and foremost, I'm a human being and citizen of the world. And then that has to coordinate everything underneath it, macro, meso, and micro. And so that's a huge project. Is it possible at all? I don't know, but it's what we need to do. And so I think that the idea that we have some clear sense of that is hopeful.
Great place to end. Thank you very much.
Okay.